writing this review for Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice was difficult for me. Whenever I play a game, I make little notes about it that, if I eventually produce a review about the game, would inform my conclusion about it. That necessarily leads to making notes that I later have to discard once I've gained more experience within the game and more context around the story and the themes it presents to me. And while that's a natural process for pretty much every review I write, I don't think finishing a game and thinking about it for a few more hours have had this big of an impact on my feelings on said game. My initial conclusion on Hellblade while playing it would have been that it was overall pretty alright. Some neat puzzles and decent if fairly repetitive combat, slightly marred by a camera that's too close for comfort to make combat fun, and a story that's a bit too much doom and gloom to be enjoyable. I know, I laugh at myself for coming to such a myopic conclusion about this game. But that's how I felt about it while playing it. I certainly had the theme of the game in mind, since Hellblade can't shut up about what it wants to be about, but my initial knee-jerk conclusion wasn't made with said theme in mind. But the more I thought about it, the more I put my criticisms I had lined up in the context of those themes, the more I realized that maybe, just maybe, the stuff I wasn't too keen on might have actually been the point and done on purpose. In fact, as you can already surmise from my facetiously performative tone, I'm pretty certain that all of it was entirely intentional. And that's why I think Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is great. In order to discuss why it's great, I will have to go into specifics. I know, it's very early in the video to issue a spoiler warning. I usually try to be vague with my criticism and talk about a few generalities before telling people to skip the remainder of the review. But as I said, the themes in Hellblade aren't just part of the subtext, they are the text. So me telling you about it would spoil part of the impact that the game could have. And more importantly, I think that all the decisions that shape the game into what it is, where all of its constituent parts are in service of that central theme, are interesting to highlight. So don't consider this a spoiler warning just for the plot. Consider it as a spoiler warning for the entire experience itself. If you really want a TLDR here, I'll gladly issue a recommendation, with the caveat that if you play the game, always keep its theme present in your mind. With that out of the way, let's explore Senua. So if the theme of the game is what makes it great, it's probably best to start with that, just like the game does. If you pay attention to the text popping up even before you start the game, you'll notice that it contains a content warning about the game dealing with psychosis. And that's not just a light content warning that there's a character in there suffering from psychosis in a game that's otherwise unrelated to the condition. No, this game is 100% about psychosis as a condition all the time. And every element, as far as I can tell, has been designed and implemented as a means to build upon this central theme. In fact, even if you don't pay attention to the blurb at the start, it becomes immediately clear that Senua, the main character of this game, lives with psychosis. The first thing that happens is that you're greeted by one of the many voices Senua constantly hears.
Hello. Who are you? Doesn't matter. Welcome. You're safe with me. I'll be right here. Nice and close so I can speak without alerting the others.
I love how the game treats us, the player, as another aspect of the psychosis itself, a spectator within Senua's head, and how at least one voice frequently breaks the fourth wall and acknowledges the player's presence. It's such a small little detail, but it shows that a lot of care and attention has gone into shaping the experience of this game. It shows that Hellblade wasn't just intended to be a quote-unquote thoughtful game that deals with a heavy subject in a misguided attempt to make the point that games are art. No, Hellblade is about giving people who don't have to live with psychosis a glimpse into their world, a way to make their lived experience tangible to everybody. Take for example these different voices Senua constantly hears. People often joke about hearing voices ordering to kill them as a simple shorthand to hint at insanity. It's often used as an offhand remark for humorous effect in a self-deprecating context. But Hellblade puts you in a position where you have to experience this, to hear someone talk at you without pause. And most of those voices aren't benevolent, they don't just dish out pleasantries. There are clearly multiple personalities present in there. One is extremely distrustful and constantly sees trickery and deceit behind everything. Another one is more defeatist and fatalistic, questioning Senua's every action. And while we as players can turn off the game and get back to our lives where the only voice we hear in our head is our own, this is something that people with psychosis can't turn off. I can't imagine what kind of hellscape they have to navigate on a daily basis when they have a voice in their head yelling at them that they're not good enough. But Hellblade certainly makes a compelling example that at least temporarily put me in their shoes. Hearing voices isn't the the only symptom people with psychosis experience. Another frequent form of perception is seeing things that aren't there, which the game is chock full of. You often get to experience scenes that clearly only happen in Senua's head, or where something gets overlaid that isn't really there, like the fire that erupts in Surt's domain, or the many illusions in Valravan's domain. I love how both of these beings and their corresponding characteristics are used to further reinforce this idea that Senua's perception is highly distorted and how it constantly keeps you on edge about what's actually real and what isn't. This lingering question again puts you into the shoes of someone who has to deal with these perceptions in their daily life. Now I admit that this, among a few other things, was something that initially didn't manage to really penetrate my experience that deeply. Mostly because this type of messing with the scenery or perception of the character we're inhabiting as players is only too common in video games. It's not rare to find games that deceive their players in order to give them a fantastical dreamscape to explore that doesn't play by the rules of reality. But again, you have to put this in the context of the theme of the game. Psychosis is very much characterized by hallucinations, so it absolutely makes sense to liberally employ them here. But it's never done just for the sake of having them, it's not just lip service being paid here. It's always used to reinforce the torment that Senua is willing to endure here. And I think this is where the game's biggest strength comes into play, which is that all that willingness to go to literal hell is for absolutely nothing. Well, at least nothing if you consider achieving the main quest as the goal here. Narratively, Hellblade is about Senua wanting to rescue the soul of her lover, Dillion. Senua is a member of a group called the Picts, a Celtic tribe that lived in northern Scotland. In Senua's specific case, she's from the Orkney Islands. Throughout the game we get to learn about her past via flashbacks. Her mother also suffered from psychosis, which granted her visions, and she was burned alive by Senua's devoutly religious father because he saw this as a curse. This traumatic event obviously amplified Senua's own psychosis to the point where her father became increasingly abusive towards her, which clearly informs her submissive personality. It's telling that the shadow that torments Senua's psyche throughout the game has its basis in her father. Eventually she manages to drag herself away from him when she encounters Dillion, who accepts her for who she is. Unfortunately, Dillion's village gets hit by the plague at some point, which Senua interprets as being her fault, a consequence of her curse. This prompts her to go into a self-imposed exile, which is actually something that was practiced in Celtic cultures by people who suffered from mental illness. During her exile, she meets the character Druth, a former slave of the Northmen who tells her of their myths and stories. When she returns to Dillion's village, she finds it ravaged and Dillion killed and ritualistically displayed by those very same Northmen, mirroring the real-life Viking raids on the Orkney Islands. Again, it's a fairly traumatic experience that only further worsens her fragile mental state, to the point where another aspect of her psychosis manifests itself. This idea that by taking Dillion's head and journeying into the mythological Norse afterlife, she could save his soul from hell. That's hell with one L, so not the burning inferno, but the Norse afterlife. And she comes to that conclusion based on zero evidence. This also seems to be a fairly common aspect of psychosis, imagining tasks, rituals, and procedures that in the mind of the person would lead to a specific result, even though there might be no rational link between the supposed cause and effect. Senua's reasoning ostensibly is that because Dillion was murdered by the Northmen, he must clearly have been trapped in their afterlife for some reason, which is why she takes off on a boat to the shores of hell. And I stress, this isn't a criticism for quote-unquote nonsensical writing. It makes perfect sense for her to come to that conclusion given her mental state. I like how this puts the entirety of the game itself on shaky ground. Is Senua really traveling to hell, or is this just another thing she imagines in her head? It's not just that her perception of the physical space around her is believably warped, where it's possible that all the supernatural stuff we see isn't actually happening. It's that the entire thing itself could just be imagined, caused by the psychosis. I love this uncertainty because that again is the point of demonstrating psychosis. It essentially makes it impossible to say anything concrete about what happens in the game with any degree of certainty. Heck, even those memories that get triggered over the course of the game could be entirely unreliable. It's absolutely fantastic how the game refuses to ever acknowledge with any certainty that anything at all in this game is real, and that it just leaves you lost in Senua's head, just like she is. The "it's all a dream" or "it was all in your head" explanation for a story is usually a weak cop-out to get out of a corner that the author has written themselves into. I know only a few stories that pull it off well, but Hellblade goes a step further than that. It doesn't have to literally invoke this trope. It's not a rug pull that happens at the very end. It's there the entire time, staring you in the face, forcing you to deal with it, just like how a psychosis forces you to deal with it. I think you get the point now. Every aspect is in service of the theme of exploring psychosis, of making it tangible to the player. But so far I've only really talked about the narrative aspect. It's time to get into the gameplay, which if you think back a few minutes I call decent but nothing special. And yeah, if taken at face value, most of the stuff you get to do in Hellblade isn't that noteworthy. There are a bunch of perspective puzzles in there that, while they don't tread any uncharted territory, at least are entertaining to solve. My affinity for perspective gameplay is well documented at this point, so it's not unwelcomed. I particularly enjoyed the puzzles that change something about the levels when you walk through door frames to navigate a space. Again, both the runes that you have to find in the environment, as well as the shifting reality of the levels, clearly tie into this idea that Senua's perception isn't reliable and that performing the ritual of walking through these door frames or aligning objects in 3D space to create a recognizable pattern would yield a specific result. We never really know for sure if the doors these runes unlock are actually locked or not, it's just that Senua is convinced by it and believes that finding these random patterns in the environment is causally linked to opening them for her. Similar to these perspective puzzles, the trial with the masks giving you two different periods of a scene to solve puzzles in isn't some groundbreaking new invention. It's basically the crack in the slab mission from Dishonored 2, where you have to navigate a mansion stuck between two time periods. But again, the fact that it's entirely unclear if anything we're seeing is actually real further ties this into the central theme. I like how the 4 trials themselves are once again a representation of something Senua thinks she has to do in order to pull the sword out of the tree it's lodged in so she can finally enter Hell. These challenges mostly don't have anything to do with collecting the shards of the sword so it might be reforged, even though they are referred to as shard challenges. I mean, the sword is already there, sticking out of the tree. Senua just can't bear touching it. No, these 4 trials are intended to force Senua to confront an aspect about herself, to come to terms with who she is and deal with the many conflicting elements of her past, which then gives her the strength to wield the sword. Now, while I like this idea of using these trials as a means to both challenge the player and explore Senua's character, I do have to say that at least one of those trials tested my patience. As mentioned before, one trial is about shifting back and forth between 2 versions of the same scene to solve some more perspective puzzles, which was fairly enjoyable. Thematically, it feels like it ties into the 2 things that seem to motivate Senua the most. On the one hand, the decrepit world seems to stem from her father's destructive influence over her mind. On the other hand, the other world seems intact and bathed in sunlight, similar to the memories Senua has of Dillion. You can also find lore stones all over the game which recount the stories that Druth has told to Senua, and this particular section is accompanied by the story of Baldur, the first Norse god to die. It's a story about even the gods having to accept death, much the same way as Senua has to accept Dillion's death. Another trial is about navigating a labyrinth where you have to follow a voice to know where you're supposed to go, which is a pretty obvious representation of introspection, having to look inwards and explore your own thoughts. The third one puts you in a largely black space where you have to find your way through a level populated by monsters that get triggered by your sounds. This segment seems to be both an illustration of the darkness inside Senua, the many fears and doubts that inhabit her, with Dillion representing a way out of that, which is why she's motivated to save his soul from hell, as well as a parable for her altered perception. Giving up the sense of sight is akin to her giving up her sense of perception that leads her to hearing all these voices and seeing these hallucinations, something that would irrevocably change who she is. This is only further reinforced through this monologue from Dillion referring to his father's blindness and that to him the concept of light and dark had no meaning. He asks Senua if that fear of the darkness means that we should blind everybody to free them from their fear of it. The one trial that somewhat frustrated me was the swamp trial. At first, its setup is fairly straightforward. You have to wade through a town that has been swallowed up by a swamp. Once you arrive inside the hut, it transforms into a maze through which we have to find a bunch of runes while being chased by a flame spirit. This once again seems to be influenced by an event of Senua's past, specifically when the plague broke out in Dillion's village, which both the villagers as well as Senua herself attribute to her quote-unquote curse. The flame spirit seems to represent both a burning hatred for Senua from the villagers as well as their aimless destructive force. Thematically, it makes sense for it to be there, but navigating the maze in order to find these runes among all the visual artifacting that the game likes to employ meant that I failed this challenge a couple of times. Up to now, I've been very content to put pretty much everything the game presents in the context of its themes, but I'm not sure if this frustration was intentional or not. And even if it was, I'm not convinced that it would be a good idea to purposely annoy your players, even if you intend to communicate a message. Still, even with that trial not being all that engaging to me, I love how these trials are more about Senua herself and her overcoming her inner fears and anxieties in the process. Both what's asked of you to do as well as the locations where you have to do it all ties very much into the character of Senua. It's not often that games use the space they're set in this well to explore the protagonist, to use the levels both for a gameplay challenge as well as a psychological landscape. Speaking of dying multiple times during one of those trials, I almost completely forgot to talk about one of the most prominent ways the game tries to mess with your head. At the start of the game, Senua's arm gets infected by some kind of corruption. The game informs you that this corruption grows larger every time Senua dies. It also states that when the corruption reaches her head, her quest would end. This implies that there's some kind of permadeath that could happen that would end the game prematurely. Now this is actually not the case. You can die as much as you want and the game won't end prematurely. It's just that maybe you thought that could happen because the phrase is left purposefully vague. It's a clever subversion of expectation and again something that ties in nicely into the overarching theme of the game, where this message just appears to you out of nowhere and tells you something and you have no idea where it came from or how valid what it's telling you is. It instills in you this idea that your progress might be irretrievably lost, which psychologically primes you for the rest of the game. Every failure could be your last one, since there's no hard counter keeping a tally of how often you've died already. Another thing I've barely mentioned up to now is the game's combat. After all, there's not much of a point to getting a sword if you don't intend to fight with it. Now I feel that the combat in this game is mostly fine, but nothing special. I was a bit annoyed by the fairly close camera placement as alluded to at the very start of this game. But upon reflection it made sense to use a more claustrophobic camera position more akin to a horror game like Resident Evil 4 or Dead Space than a typical action game. Its proximity to Senua makes sure that maintaining an overview over the battlefield, especially once multiple enemies start becoming the norm, is a perennial challenge. Particularly because enemies have a habit of trying to surround you and attack you from off-screen. I like how the game eschews a HUD entirely, especially during the combat, so it gets to use those voices in Senua's head to guide the player. They both indicate incoming swings from enemies as well as give feedback about Senua's health through the way they talk, so you have to pay attention to what they're saying. The actual combat itself is fairly traditional. You have a light attack, a heavy attack, a kick and a block, and if you time your blocks right you can parry attacks and also build up a meter that lets you enter bullet time, focus mode, so you can wail on enemies to quickly dispose of them. Said enemies are all represented as the Northmen that attacked Dillion's village, so it makes sense to see them as the brutes you have to overcome on your journey. Outside of that, there are also a few boss fights. The aforementioned Surt and Valravan are relatively straightforward. Surt is like a more beefed up version of the regular Northmen, and Valravan has a few neat attack patterns that require you to stay on your toes a lot. The third boss fight is against Garm, a large boar-like beast that first stalks you through Helheim before you get to confront it. I got a bit of a Dark Souls-y vibe from this boss fight, which was nice, but it's not as difficult as the bosses from those games. And that's pretty much the last boss you'll fight. Oh sure, there are some more enemies to fight on your way to confronting Hela herself, especially once you reach her inner sanctum when she unleashes hordes of enemies that even shapeshift between the three bosses from earlier, but there's no actual final boss fight in this game. And I think the reason for that is that Hela is not a foe that needs to be overcome through combat. Maybe I'm wrong here, but to me Hela looks eerily similar to Senua herself. This implies to me that Senua's journey to Hell in order to bargain for Dillion's soul isn't so much for her to ask Hela to return Dillion back to life, which is something the mythological Hela was supposed to be able to. No, to me this is more about finally coming to grips with Dillion's death and confronting her own inner darkness, manifested in the form of the goddess of the underworld. The final cutscene depicts Hela slaying Senua as per her own request. She then takes Dillion's head and throws it out of her domain. But when the camera pans back up, we see Senua instead standing where Hela stood. To me this clearly hints at the fact that Senua has both accepted Dillion's death as well as overcome her internal struggle with her psychosis, where she can now see it as a part of herself and not as a curse or a darkness as her father implied. This is also why I think the entire quest was in Senua's mind altogether, a confrontation between Senua and her inner demons to make sense of her life and to come out of it with new strength. As I said at the start of this review, it was really hard to write, and sitting down and thinking about this game more thoroughly changed my opinion of it dramatically. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice might not invent something new here, the gameplay doesn't really innovate or uniquely stand out compared to other games. But what makes this game brilliant is that it uses all its constituent parts to reinforce its narrative and themes. Good art always tries to make as many aspects of itself meaningful to the thematic core of the piece, and Hellblade succeeds like few games that I've played before. It tackles a heavy subject gracefully, and it's a testament to the fact that games can be both art and wonderful tools to teach their audience something through the experiences they provide us with. Empathizing with people who live with psychosis is hard, and I can't claim that I can fully comprehend what it truly feels like, but it has certainly given me a compelling glimpse into that mindset, and that's something not a lot of games have achieved.